It's 10 o'clock. Good evening. Welcome to The World Tonight. I'm Razia Iqbal. After widespread criticism of the current testing system, the government has announced plans to significantly increase the number of tests to detect coronavirus in England.
I am now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month. That is the goal, and I am determined that we will get there.
We'll speak to a former Tory health minister and the shadow health secretary. Also, a special World Tonight investigation on potential life-saving medicine for COVID-19 patients that critics say should have been used weeks ago but wasn't allowed by the government. Record unemployment figures in the United States and Spain. And is the world's largest megacity, Tokyo, on the cusp of a major virus outbreak?
We are at the crossroads. Unless Japanese people behave very responsibly, we may end up with a very serious situation.
That's all after the BBC News, read tonight by Zeb Sones.
The Health Secretary has set a new target of carrying out 100,000 coronavirus tests in England every day by the end of the month. Matt Hancock, who has recently ended his 7-day self-isolation period after being diagnosed with COVID-19, said he was determined to meet the goal. In the last 24 hours, a further 569 patients with coronavirus have died in the UK, bringing the total number of deaths in hospitals to nearly 3,000. Here's our health correspondent, Nick Triggle.
The government has been heavily criticised in recent days for its approach to testing. Germany is able to carry out 3 times as many tests as the UK can. Currently, 10,000 a day are being done here, but now ministers say they will get to 100,000 a day by the end of the month. Under the new plan, the government will get commercial companies and universities involved in testing. New antibody tests will also be rolled out to see if a person has been exposed to the virus previously and developed immunity to help achieve the new target. But problems remain. There is still a shortage of the testing equipment and the chemicals needed to diagnose an infection, and there is no guarantee the new antibody test will actually work.
The Director of Health Improvement for Public Health England, Professor John Newton, has been appointed to help deliver the government's testing plan. He said testing would be important in determining when the current social distancing measures could be relaxed.
The lockdown is an extraordinary measure to take, but there's no doubt scientifically that it's required at the moment, and it should continue really as long as the scientific evidence suggests that that is the right thing to do to control the spread of the infection. And the difficult thing is that we don't quite know yet how long that is going to be.
More than 1 million cases of COVID-19 and 50,000 deaths have now been registered worldwide. In Spain, 950 people have died in 24 hours, the country's highest daily tally so far. Italy's nationwide death count is now almost 14,000. Ministers are being asked to consider reopening mothballed factories and have them make personal protective equipment for frontline NHS staff. There are still concerns that not enough kit is available in all parts of the health service. Earlier, new guidelines were issued to staff clarifying under what circumstances the equipment should be worn. Faye Kirkland, a practising GP herself, has more details.
Until now, staff were asked to wear personal protective equipment, or PPE, if they were seeing a suspected case or a confirmed case of COVID-19. Now healthcare workers having direct contact with patients with no symptoms should wear a mask and eye protection such as goggles if they feel at risk, as well as single-use gloves and an apron. There are further clarifications too on when and which type of equipment should be worn in all clinical settings, from hospitals to GP surgeries, ambulance workers and community staff, as well as certain high-risk areas such as intensive care. Patients too will now be asked to wear a surgical mask on wards or in waiting rooms if they have a suspected case or a confirmed coronavirus diagnosis to protect NHS staff and other patients.
Officials in France have requisitioned a building at a large fresh food market on the outskirts of Paris to be used as a temporary morgue. The decision is in response to the increasing numbers of coronavirus deaths in the region and fears funeral directors may be unable to cope. The first bodies are expected to be moved to the hall tomorrow. From Paris, Hugh Schofield reports.
It's a refrigerated warehouse in the Rungis food market just south of the capital that is being taken over. It'll have a capacity to receive up to 1,000 coffins. A police statement said it will allow the bodies of coronavirus victims to be looked after with dignity and proper sanitary precautions as they await burial or cremation. Spread out over a vast area near Orly Airport, Rungis is Europe's biggest food market, and the warehouse is separate from most of the commercial activity.
The leaders of centre-right political parties in 13 European countries have asked for Hungary's ruling Fidesz party to be expelled from their common group, the EPP, because of the extraordinary measures it's taken over the coronavirus outbreak. They say the decision to let the Prime Minister Viktor Orban rule by decree under an emergency that he can extend at will is a clear violation of liberal democracy and European values. The Financial Conduct Authority has unveiled a series of measures to help people deal with cash shortages because of coronavirus. The regulator has asked banks and lenders to freeze credit card payments and charge no interest on overdrafts up to £500. The scheme, which is subject to a consultation, is expected to come into force for 3 months from next week. People across the UK have paid a second tribute to NHS staff and other key workers dealing with the pandemic, honouring them with a national round of applause. Households banged pots and pans and set off firecrackers while others played the bagpipes to show their support. The Clap for Carers event is now expected to take place every Thursday evening at 8 o'clock. A record number of people have been identified as suspected modern slavery victims in the UK during the past year. Official figures for 2019 list more than 10,000 potential victims of trafficking, slavery and forced labour, up 52% on the year before. The Home Office suggests the increase in referrals is in part down to increased awareness of the crime. The comedian Eddie Large, best known as one half of Little and Large, has died at the age of 78. His family said he contracted coronavirus in hospital while being treated for heart failure. Eddie Large, along with Sid Little, was a well-known face on TV in the 1970s and 80s. Our entertainment correspondent, Colin Patterson, looks back at his life.
Little and Large, Little and Large, Little and Large. At its peak, the Little and Large show attracted audiences of more than 15 million. The duo had broken through after winning Opportunity Knocks in 1971. Eddie Large's role always to make jokes at the expense of his partner Sid Little. There were also his impressions.
Harry Seacombe's car starting up on a cold morning.
With their brand of old-fashioned honest humour, they were a fixture on BBC One from 1978 until 1991. But after that, seldom spoke, with Eddie retiring after a heart transplant in 2003. However, they reunited to appear on Ant and Dec's Saturday Night Takeaway 2 years ago.
Colin Patterson on the comedian Eddie Large, who has died.
Zeb, thank you. You're listening to The World Tonight with Razia Iqbal. The world has reached a significant milestone today. There are now more than 1 million confirmed cases of the coronavirus. 50,000 people have died and more than 200,000 have recovered. Those who are still ill and in need of medical help continues to pose the greatest of challenges for even the best equipped health systems. And governments everywhere are under growing scrutiny over how they are dealing with the crisis. We'll hear tonight from Japan, where there are growing fears that the most populous city in the world, Tokyo, is on the cusp of a major outbreak. In the US, the number of people who registered for unemployment benefit was more than 6.6 million last week. But first here, the issue of testing continues to be in the spotlight after several days of criticism over failures of testing, including the prioritisation of the public over doctors and nurses. Today, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, laid out what he called a new 5-pillar strategy. One of those pillars, to increase testing further.
Taken together, I am now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month. That is the goal, and I am determined that we will get there.
He admitted there would be challenges in the weeks and months ahead.
There will be problems, like many of those that we've already overcome. After all, building a brand new industry, it's not easy. There will be bumps in the road, and criticisms made, and some of them will be justified. And I return from illness more determined than ever to fight this disease. We'll bring together the best minds, we'll bring together the best science that this country has to offer, and we'll work with our friends and allies from around the world as we do so.
Well, there are still concerns about the speed of testing and the availability of protective kit in parts of the health service. Dr. Wesley Tenzel runs a GP practice in Lee in Greater Manchester.
A lot of it is, we need to go further, we need to do more. We know that's what we need to do. We just need to stop saying it and start doing it. He gave a timeline, which is something great, so we can hold him to that. So at the end of April, I should have been tested. At the moment, it sounds great. He'll have the headlines tomorrow that this is what's going to happen, but I'll be out seeing patients potentially tomorrow. I'll only have the protection because I've gone and bought it myself, but I know a lot of my colleagues won't have this protection. Until we get that, we're not safe. And sadly, some of us are going to die because we're not being protected. So until that happens, I don't think any of the GPs would really be happy with necessarily what we're hearing, because you can say anything, can talk the talk, we need to walk the walk now.
Well, let's speak first to Jonathan Ashworth, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary. Good evening, John Ashworth. What do you make of what Matt Hancock said today?
Well, we're pleased that the government now recognises that it has to radically ramp up our testing capability. We've been calling for this for some time, but although we do note that only a couple of weeks ago Boris Johnson was saying we'll have 250,000 tests a day. We're now promised 100,000 by the end of the month. Of course, today I think we finally hit the 10,000 a day promise, but that has taken us some weeks. Everybody agrees, every expert agrees that the exit strategy from this lockdown is ultimately more mass testing in the community, contact tracing. So we hope that the government can move quickly to ramping up our testing capability, because it really is key to beating this virus.
You say you hope the government can do this. Jeremy Hunt, who has been critical of the government's record on testing, says that he feels that this is good news for the NHS, but that clearly you don't promise 100,000 tests a day with a firm deadline unless you are deadly serious. Is it your view that the government is deadly serious?
Well, I hope they are serious. And Jeremy Hunt, who is of course, the former Conservative Health Secretary, has actually been far more critical of the government's approach to this than I have, funnily enough. But the government have given us this commitment of 100,000 tests a day. It's not the 250,000 Boris Johnson promised, of course. But one of the issues where we still need details is that it wasn't clear from Matt Hancock today what proportion of these tests are the antibody test. That's the test which tells you whether you've had the virus, and what proportion of the test will be the PCR test. That's the test that tells you whether you have the virus here and now.
But isn't it concerning that antibody test has not actually been developed yet? Obviously, work is going on, but it's not there.
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. So the government are putting setting a lot of store by this particular antibody test, but we don't know whether we've got an antibody test that works. We don't know how it will be rolled out. We don't know who would have access to it. We don't know who would be prioritised in the broader population. They haven't got, they tell us they've bought millions of these tests that need to be evaluated, but they clearly haven't bought a test per 60 million, they haven't bought a test per person in the country. So we don't know who would get it, who wouldn't get it, how they'll be distributed. And at the same time, that is by its nature a rare view test. It only tells you if you've had it. We also need all our NHS staff, all our care staff, to be getting tested now, because many of them are taking time off work because they think they might have the virus. They need to know whether they've got the virus, because that impacts on whether they can go back to the front line in the NHS.
And there is also a concern that, of course, some of these tests that have been tried out are unreliable.
Well, yes, but that's why they've got to properly evaluate it, because I think it was Spain who bought a batch of tests from China, and it turned out that something like 30% of them were incorrect. So that's why it's important that the tests are evaluated. And one of my worries is, and I hope it's not borne out, but one of my worries is that the government have today raised expectations that they're going to be able to deliver a load of tests when they've not actually completed the evaluations, and we don't know if those tests are actually going to work.
Okay.
But I hope they haven't raised expectations on that.
Jonathan Ashworth, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, thanks very much. Let's speak now to Steve Bryan, Conservative MP, and he was a health minister until March last year. Raising too high an expectation, what do you think that this target is achievable?
I hope so. I think it is. I mean, look, we have been slow on testing. That is not my opinion. That is just fact. But the system has been slow and it has been bureaucratic. And in many ways, I feel for ministers who have had to defend the situation. But there's obviously been a lot of work going on in recent days while the Secretary of State has been in isolation. And I thought there was a real renewed sense of grip from him tonight, certainly around the messaging, around being upfront, which is critical with the public, around the testing capacity that we've got in this country. And it can't just all be PHE, who do tend to gather this to themselves, and around the global shortages of raw materials that are required. But I think we have been slow. But actually, I mean, we're not Germany. We can't always be blamed for not being Germany, but we do have one of the largest testing programs in Europe, but we need more. And the reason we need more is because we need to know who we can get back to work. And then, as John Ashworth rightly says, we need to move into community testing. But, he mentioned...
Do you think, though, do you think, though, that this is a realistic target? Because it's now gone down to 100,000 tests from 250, which was clearly a mistake.
Yes, I do believe that it is a realistic target, and I tell you why. Because, as the Secretary of State said today on Question Time tonight and in Downing Street before then, it is a real national effort now. It is not just PHE that's doing it. The 5-point plan that he talked about was the swab test, yes, but also the antibody tests. He talked about involving creating a British diagnostics industry. So this is a Nightingale hospital for the testing industry. And if we've created the hospital for 40,000 people, we can certainly work in with the pharmaceutical giants. You heard about how Glaxo have stepped up to the mark on this. So yes, I do think with that new national effort of companies turning their attention to testing as opposed to what they were doing before the crisis, I do think that it is entirely achievable. But more to the point, it needs to be. And what I don't want to see is us get to the end of April and then be saying, well, why haven't we got there? I think what we need to see, and what we didn't hear today, is we need to see markers in the road from the government so that as we move through April, we can see that we're actually making progress and we're getting to where we need to get to. But with the whole pharma industry behind us, the whole of government behind us, and the 2 tests, I think, yes, this absolutely is achievable, and it needs to be, because as Dr. Tedros has said from the start, the way out of lockdown, the way out of this is to test. And it sounds like we are really now getting to grip with that. And I think Matt Hancock deserves great credit for the way that he's done that today. I have great confidence in him, and I think your listeners should too.
Steve Bryan, Conservative MP, and was a former health minister until March last year. Thanks. Now, as the numbers of people infected with coronavirus soared during March, this programme has discovered that the government prevented hospitals from giving potentially life-saving medicine to patients with the disease. In guidance seen by The World Tonight, the Department of Health and NHS stopped doctors prescribing any drugs to tackle the virus to patients unless they were part of a nationwide clinical trial. That's left many hospitals unable to use drugs being recommended by clinicians treating the disease in Italy and China. The World Tonight's Andrew Hoskin has this report.
There is much we do not know about the coronavirus, but there are 2 things we do know for sure. We know that there is as yet no vaccine with which we can protect ourselves against it, and we do know that there is no standard cure. At the moment in this country, the only standard treatment available is paracetamol, and in more severe cases, it's oxygen. That is the stark truth here. But it is not the truth elsewhere, outside the UK, where severe COVID-19 cases have been treated with drugs already available for other medical conditions. The virus kills and harms people by spreading infection through their bodies, but it also can do so by the severe immune response it often seems to provoke in the body, leading to hyperinflammation in internal organs such as the lungs and heart. We've spoken to 3 medical experts in treating patients with hyperinflammation. They've spoken to us on grounds of anonymity, so their words have been transcribed and voiced by BBC colleagues. One expert I've spoken to is a consultant rheumatologist.
I do see a lot of patients with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, but I'm much more interested in these strange hyperinflammatory patients. So what we're seeing with the COVID patients is that there is an initial viral infection and then something else happens. The immune system is switched on or activated in some way that we don't understand, and we think, but we don't have proof, that they are behaving a bit like our usual patients with hyperinflammation. We recognise that, and we think this is what is happening, and so do lots and lots of doctors from across the entire world.
Doctors outside the UK, in countries including China and France, have already been using two types of drugs to treat severe COVID cases. The first is a drug called hydroxychloroquine, which is used to treat conditions including malaria and arthritis, and it's sometimes used in conjunction with an antibiotic, again with an unusual sounding name, azithromycin. The United States licensed the use of hydroxychloroquine only this week, and in a small study of tens of severe COVID cases in France, the combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin completely cleared the virus from the cells of 6 patients. But the UK insists on carrying out its own randomised controlled trial of hydroxychloroquine before agreeing to its use here, a position with which one leading expert in respiratory medicine profoundly disagrees. Again, he wishes to remain anonymous, so again we have revoiced his words.
The issue is that there were a lot of people who've been infected and have been hospitalised and have died before these trials were even open and ready to recruit people. And yet we've been unable and prevented from giving any of the medications that other people have reported may help. So I think that is a quite difficult position to justify. It's crazy, actually. I think you could find yourself in a situation that you could justify carrying out a randomised control trial from a health economic perspective and from a scientific perspective, while allowing individual physicians to try anything they possibly can until there is a trial specifically to study that intervention. Without such a study, then we're left in a situation that we're starting from scratch, because we've ignored the rest of the world's experience on this. So if you get ill with COVID in the UK, then you're likely to get a worse deal than you would do if you fall ill in a lot of other countries. The hydroxychloroquine data emerged from China, and I know they've done a number of trials, and it's based on that trial data that hydroxychloroquine has been licensed in China and has been adopted across the world. The UK has adopted a position where it seems no other previous information or experience is valid.
While hydroxychloroquine may prove effective in preventing the virus from spreading into the cell and then the rest of the body, some experts believe that another type of drug could prove effective in tackling the hyperinflammation that often happens. This is so-called anti-cytokine therapy, the cytokine being a small protein released by the body to help fight infection. But these proteins also trigger inflammation. The government is also strongly discouraging the use of anti-cytokine drugs, as was made clear this week to clinicians by the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, in a letter seen by this programme. In his note, Professor Whitty stresses the importance of medical trials. He said,
"We strongly discourage the use of off-licence treatments outside a trial where participation in a trial is possible. Use of treatments outside of a trial where participation was possible is a wasted opportunity to create information that will benefit others."
But the consultant in respiratory medicine disagrees, and he criticised the planned government trial.
I think the position of the Chief Medical Officer, and as a consequence the government, has been that you have to prove things work by performing your own randomised control trial. And to date, there's just been a handful of people who've been recruited to the only randomised control trial that is up and running, and that RCT has 4 treatment arms, I think, of which one of them is with hydroxychloroquine, just on its own as a single agent, and the other 3 treatment arms are almost certainly useless, or worse than useless.
39 specialists with a depth of experience in treating hyperinflammation, haematologists, infection disease specialists, rheumatologists and intensive care specialists met on March the 20th and wrote to the CMO, Professor Whitty, on the 24th of March. The letter said, Some of our members have already used targeted cytokine inhibition to treat cases in the UK with success. The note made clear that the government's policy left clinicians and patients in limbo and recommended a judicious use of drugs in a highly selected subpopulation, adding, "In times of crisis, the way we assess risk and plan action changes. Development and humanitarian organisations have proved that different sets of standards for crisis response and longer-term development programmes are appropriate. We must recognise that in these moments, following standard procedures risks losing rather than saving lives." A third consultant clinician, specialising in treating patients with hyperinflammation, also spoke to us anonymously. She said giving clinicians the freedom they want to treat patients could prove critical in the coming days and weeks.
Currently, the standard of care for COVID-19 is just paracetamol and ventilation if patients need it, but we're not actually treating anything at the moment. I think there's increasing evidence, although it may not yet be high-quality evidence, that treatments such as hydroxychloroquine, with or without azithromycin, may be very useful in these patients. And that if you get a reduction in the amount of patients going to the intensive therapy unit, even 5%, that dramatically changes the prognosis for those patients and also the impact on the hospitals themselves. And we know the numbers of patients coming through accident and emergency departments who are then likely to go to the ITU and the impact that that's having on the doctors and nurses and rest of the service. So just reducing that death rate and that intensive therapy unit rate is absolutely critical, particularly right now, given the doubling rates of COVID in London and the number of ITU beds that we know we do or don't have.
The government does appear to have softened its stance somewhat over the last few days from what appeared to many to have been an outright ban on the use of unlicensed medicines for COVID patients. A spokesman for the Department of Health and Social Care stressed the importance of trials, but said that clinicians may prescribe an unlicensed medicine for a patient outside a trial where they consider the benefits may outweigh the risks of using that medicine.
Andrew Hoskin reporting. Now, there are more signs of the stunning scope of the economic disaster because of the pandemic. Here, the majority of Nissan's 6,000 Sunderland plant employees are to be furloughed or suspended because they cannot be paid. BA is also to temporarily suspend more than 30,000 of its cabin crew and staff. And in the US, an eye-watering number. More than 6.6 million people have filed for unemployment benefit in the last week. All indications that economies could be heading for recession, if not depression. Let's speak to Jason Furman. He is Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and former Chief Economic Advisor to President Barack Obama. Welcome to the programme. The gravity of the US unemployment figures looks pretty staggering. How does the economic downturn that is almost certain to ensue compared to the 2008 crisis?
This is a much more abrupt economic shutdown than we've ever seen. What happened in the last 2 weeks is equivalent to the worst damage we saw in 3 months during the financial crisis. And there's probably many millions more that have even lost their jobs already and just not been able to get through on the phone lines to claim their unemployment insurance benefits.
And would you go as far to say that this is comparable to 1929 and the Great Depression, of what might happen in the next few months?
I mean, there is a difference, which is that in 1929 you lost jobs month after month after month. We're not going to lose 6 million jobs a week for month after month after month. The other thing about the Great Depression was it represented a large-scale policy failure. Governments could have stopped it, and they didn't. This time, everyone in the world, central banks and fiscal policymakers, are doing a lot. Maybe they should do more, maybe they should do different, but I don't think any of them are anything like the terrible failure that was part of why we had a Great Depression.
And do you think that the huge relief packages in the US, more than $2 trillion, in Germany, $400 billion, do you think that those will be enough to deal with what is clearly a global economic crisis?
They won't be enough. More will be needed. They're large down payments. They're a great start. They happened really quickly, but they're going to need to be extended. They're going to need to be expanded. I think different countries are also going to need to deploy different things, especially as we're all watching each other and learning from each other at this time.
And when you look at economies that are more vulnerable than, say, the United States or Germany, Spain, Italy, their ability to cope in the aftermath of what really has been devastating for them in terms of the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah, you have to be worried. I mean, the Italian economy and fiscal situation was in bad shape before this. You're going to, need something like a Corona bond, some broader European level borrowing, because the United States, the UK have a lot of ability to borrow, Germany a lot of ability to borrow. Italy will face constraints, but it's going to need that money to rebuild after this.
Jason Furman, Professor of Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and former Chief Economic Advisor to President Obama. Thanks for joining us. To Japan now, which has announced it will ban all travellers from the United States, China and most of Europe starting tomorrow in its efforts to stem the spread of COVID-19. Until last week, Japan appeared to be succeeding in keeping the spread of the virus under control. 2.5 months after recording its first case, Japan still has only around 3,000 confirmed cases and 68 deaths. But in the last week, cases in the capital, Tokyo, have begun to rise rapidly, leading to fears that the world's most populous megacity may be on the cusp of a major outbreak. From Tokyo, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports.
This was the sound of central Tokyo just a few days ago. Streets still packed with shoppers, bars and restaurants crowded till the early hours. More than 2 months into the coronavirus pandemic, life in Japan has remained remarkably normal. Until now.
Well, this is the sound of central Tokyo this morning. There are still people out on the streets. There are still lorries and vans making deliveries, people walking to work, going shopping. But it is much, much quieter than just a few days ago. All the city's parks have now been closed and people have been told to stay at home at the weekend and not go out in the evening.
The reason? The Japanese government now fears this, the world's largest urban conurbation, may be on the verge of a major outbreak.
Very fortunately, until today, we have been able to avoid the worst case scenario. But it doesn't mean that we can relax.
Shigeru Omi is Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's chief medical advisor.
I think we are really at the crossroads. Unless Japanese people behave very responsibly, we may end up with the very serious situation.
But millions of Tokyoites are still having to go to work, mostly on the city's overcrowded metro system. Shops and restaurants are still open, and on the streets, young people in particular appear to have little understanding of the dangers from the virus.
I'm going out to eat lunch. I have a meeting, so I will be out until night time.
I do feel like it's other people's problem, so it's hard to imagine myself being infected with it.
Perhaps most surprising is Japan's lack of testing. The UK is now testing around 8,000 people a day. In the last 2 months, Japan has tested a total of just 35,000 people. Experts like Professor Kenji Shibuya of King's College London say this is leaving Japan extremely exposed.
Still, the testing capacity in Japan is very limited, so there may be outbreaks yet to be found in the community. Unless we understand the true magnitude of transmission, we don't know where we are and what to be done, and what works and what doesn't.
Over the last couple of months, I've been told by lots of people here, including many foreign residents, that Japan is different. For example, people here have a habit of wearing masks if they have a cough or a cold. Japanese people generally do not shake hands, they bow. And this is a country that really is fanatical about hygiene.
This is the sound of 2-year-olds in a local kindergarten doing their daily hand-washing class. This didn't start because of the coronavirus. They've been doing these classes here for decades. But experts like Professor Shibuya say the idea that Japan is different is dangerously complacent.
There's very limited evidence on that. Hand washing is very useful, but behaviors like we don't hack, that may be helping to some extent, but that's not a major source of difference in terms of preventing transmission.
The Prime Minister's medical advisor, Shigeru Omi, agrees.
Japanese culture, Japanese mentality is one of the factors responsible for this current situation. But again, no time to relax, no time for complacency.
Wearing face masks and washing hands may have helped to slow the spread of the virus here. But sadly, the evidence now suggests that Japan is very far from being immune to COVID-19.
That report was by Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. Extraordinary times may well require extraordinary powers, and many political leaders have had to use them to deal with the pandemic. In Hungary, earlier this week, the parliament gave Prime Minister Viktor Orbán sweeping new powers, including the power to rule by decree with no time limit. That, according to opposition groups and human rights groups, is going too far given Mr. Orbán's track record. They argue it puts Hungarian democracy in quarantine. And now leaders of centre-right parties from 13 European countries have asked for Hungary's ruling Fidesz party to be expelled from their common group, the EPP. Speaking to the BBC earlier today, the Hungarian government spokesman, Zoltán Kovács, defended the introduction of these new powers.
Those extraordinary measures last only until the end of the extraordinary times, so they don't become part of the legal system. Our concept is that if it's required, if it's needed, if it's urgency, these decrees are going to be issued. Extraordinary measures are required to address the extraordinary circumstances caused by the virus and fighting the virus.
Well, let's speak now to Aura Sala from Finland's National Coalition Party, which is a member of the European People's Party. She joins us on the line from Brussels. Are you not convinced by that defence of these special powers being given to Viktor Orbán? What is it that concerns you?
Well, there are many things that concerns me, but these measures allow Orbán to rule by decree and bypass the National Assembly, and there is no end date to this. And on top of this, there is a pure censorship now in the country against freedom of speech and expression and independent journalism, because the government is the only source that can actually give information about the virus. So Orbán is basically reducing democratic control, and none of these powers that he has taken to himself are needed to fight corona.
And what is it that you think that should happen now? Because the party has already been suspended and you're calling for its expulsion from the EPP?
Absolutely. In the EU, free parliamentary democracy is one of the core values, and we cannot look the other way. This is a critical moment for our common values and credibility. The EPP must expel Fidesz, and also the EU must react. We should freeze EU cohesion funding for Hungary.
Angela Merkel's, Germany's Angela Merkel's CDU party is part of the EPP, and they haven't joined you in saying that the Fidesz party should be expelled.
We are expecting them to join us now. There are not only countries and parties from Nordic states, but also from all over Europe now calling for an expulsion to expel Fidesz, and I hope that our German friends will also join us.
Hungary clearly doesn't want to be thrown out of the European Union, and that obviously isn't on the cards. But the relationship between Hungary and the EU is really coming under huge strain. Is that a good idea in the context of what needs to be much more collaborative approaches to dealing with this pandemic?
To be honest, I think that we need to have our credibility even after this crisis. And if there are parties, if there are countries who are not respecting our common values and our common rules, I think that there must be consequences. And that's why I think that EU must react. And for example, freezing some cohesion funding from Hungary, that would be a real sign that EU can also react.
The Hungarians, and Zoltán Kovács in particular, says that Hungary has become the target of what he is calling a political witch hunt.
Well, I think that is one of these misinformation and fake news that we are hearing coming from Hungary also. They must know what are the core values of the European Union, and rule of law, for example, and also free democracy, parliamentary democracy. Those are the values that they have signed on once they joined the European Union, and they need to respect them.
Ara Salo from Finland's National Coalition Party, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, staying home may well be proving a challenge for many, but what of those who don't have one? For the thousands of homeless or those who are sleeping rough, rules on physical and social isolation aren't much good if you're wandering the streets and potentially spreading the virus. Local councils were ordered to get everyone off the streets within 72 hours. Rather tall order, some said, given that the problem of homelessness has persisted despite years of trying to address it. The World Tonight's Paul Moss reports now on the attempt at rapid rehousing.
I managed to reach Bob while he was walking around Bristol this afternoon. He answered on a rather dodgy mobile phone line. A former member of the Royal Artillery, Bob served with the army in Germany and Northern Ireland. But he's been homeless on and off for several years now. Although he has a friend's sofa to sleep on, the coronavirus crisis has seen him out on the streets for much of the time. And it's harder now, he says, because the support facilities he used to rely on have closed their operations because of social distancing rules.
They're cancelled because of this coronavirus. So you're not going to get food, it's not there. Well, in the mornings, you can go and get breakfast, cooked breakfast, but that meal's gone, it's not there. But I have to beg now, somebody is kind enough to give me a couple of quid. I don't know whether they got a virus or whatever. I'm sat there and somebody sneezes over me or whatever. I don't know.
The government has promised homeless people will be looked after during this emergency. Last week, they told local councils they had to get anyone sleeping rough off the streets and into safe accommodation within 3 days. And homelessness charities I've spoken to say most local authorities have responded well to this sudden and urgent requirement, though by no means all. And the challenge has been immense. Plymouth City Council, for example, likes to pride itself on having cut homelessness recently. But their cabinet member for housing, Chris Penberthy, says the coronavirus crisis presented near impossible demands.
One of the ways we've been managing to get people off the street in Plymouth is through dormitories and people in shared accommodation. Unfortunately, the government's told us we need everyone in self-contained single accommodation with facilities that mean that they're isolatable. And we got contingency funding of £14,000. We've so far spent £80,000 in the last fortnight. So we've managed to feed homeless people so far, but in the coming weeks, I don't know.
It was only 4 months ago that the Canterbury-based charity Catching Lives was putting out one of its regular Christmas appeals to support its work with the homeless.
It's hard to fight the cold. At least you've got someone.
The charity's general manager, Terry Gore, says they're used to providing support out in the community. That's particularly needed for those homeless people who, for various reasons, are unable to accept conventional housing assistance. He fears that many of these will now slip through the net, and with hardly any charities now able to provide outreach assistance, these people's prospects, he said, do not look good.
There are some people with underlying mental health issues, maybe severe anxiety problems, who struggle to be around lots of other people. So moving to that sort of environment, which is a hotel where there's lots of noises and lots of people about, they wouldn't be comfortable in that environment. We are trying to educate some of those clients about what the current crisis involves. And there are still, I would guess, on a national basis, there are probably still some thousands of people still out there.
A government spokesman said this evening that the vast majority of rough sleepers known to local authorities were now in safe accommodation. The result, they said, of a collaborative effort backed by £1.6 billion of government funding. But for one organisation campaigning on homelessness, the response to all this has been, why only now? Tasmin Maitland from Homeless Link says the crisis has shown how much better some local councils were prepared than others, and how much they can achieve.
Local areas that had existing strong partnerships between councils and charities and community groups have been able to respond far more effectively. Where that hasn't been in place previously, we're seeing it's a slower process. But the current crisis shows us the type of action that can happen if there's political leadership, resources provided. It shouldn't take a pandemic to help us to end a housing crisis.
That report was from Paul Moss. Our main headline tonight: the government has sought to end days of intense criticism by announcing plans to significantly increase coronavirus testing in England. Let's end tonight with some much-needed good news. After months of severe droughts, one of the world's great natural wonders has roared back to life. The sound of the world's largest waterfall, Victoria Falls in southern Africa. Just months ago, severe droughts had almost turned it dry. Today, after heavy rains, the Zambezi River, which feeds it, is at its highest level for 20 years, and the Victoria Falls roars once again. That's The World Tonight. I'm Razia Iqbal. From me and everyone on the programme, good night.
Studio direction was by John Ward. The editor was Jonathan Fenton Fisher.
And then I'm going to ask them to speak for 60 seconds.
It's the comedy panel show that's been delighting audiences for over half a century.
Welcome to Just a Minute.
Now you can enjoy some classic editions every Sunday. So that's more of this.
Are you saying yes, there was a hesitation? All right.
More of this.
Repetition. Of what?
Or blah, blah, blah.
That's right.
And a bit more of this.
Oh, well, I'm deviating now, aren't I? So I won't.
Just a Minute classic episodes. Sunday nights at 7:15 on BBC Radio 4.
Well, now the book at bedtime, and Anton Lesser continues Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light here on Radio 4, charting the rise and fall of Thomas Cromwell. It is June 1540, and Cromwell is in the Tower awaiting interrogation. Betrayed by most of his old colleagues, all he can do now is plead to the king for mercy.
Late afternoon, Rafe comes in. It is clear from his face there is no good news. "My Lord Cromwell," he says, "here is Archbishop Cranmer's letter." He takes it and walks to the light. The paper seems to shake as he unfolds it. The Archbishop, having heard of Cromwell's treason, expresses himself both sorrowful and amazed. "I loved him as my friend, for so I took him to be, but I chiefly loved him for the love which I thought I saw him bear ever towards your grace. But now," he looks up, "now it comes, on the one hand, on the other. But now, if he be a traitor, I am sorry that I ever loved or trusted him." He folds the paper. "Rafe, Cranmer and I agreed long ago that if one of us looked set to go down, the other would save himself. Do not resign yourself, I beg you. You know the king is impulsive." "Is he? We always say so." "And Boleyn thought till her last moment that he would change his mind. She died incredulous." When Rafe leaves him, he turns back to Cranmer's letter. He sees the question his Archbishop leaves for Henry. "Who will your grace trust thereafter, if you cannot trust him?" That evening he sits down to write to the king. The late afternoon had brought